Scary telling.
I never used to be afraid of the dark. In fact, I would often stay up late, reading or watching TV, without a care in the world. But that all changed one night. I was lying in bed, with my feet dangling out of the covers. I had just finished watching a scary movie, but I wasn't too scared. That is until I felt a hand grab my feet. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I was still spooked from the movie. But then I felt it again. This time, it was firmer, more insistent. I tried to pull my feet back under the covers, but the hand held on tight. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even scream. All I could do was lay there, feeling the cold, clammy grip on my feet. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call out for help, and I didn't want to look under the bed to see what was there. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the hand let go. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of my room, heart racing. I went to my parents' room, but they were fast asleep. I tried to wake them up, but they just grumbled and told me to go back to bed. But I couldn't go back to bed. Not after what had just happened. I stayed up all night, too afraid to close my eyes. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump, and I could still feel the hand on my feet. The next day, I tried to brush it off as just a nightmare. Maybe I had fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But deep down, I knew it was real. I was afraid to go back into my room, but I had no choice. That night, I made sure to keep my feet safely tucked under the covers. I even put a chair under the doorknob, just in case. But as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from under the bed. I froze. It was coming from right where the hand had grabbed me the night before. I listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching grew louder and more frantic, and then suddenly stopped. I tried to convince myself that it was just a mouse or a stray cat, but I knew deep down that it wasn't. Something was under my bed, and it wasn't friendly. Over the next few nights, things only got worse. I would hear strange noises coming from under my bed, like whispering and giggling. Sometimes, I would wake up to find my blankets had been pulled off of me, even though I knew I had wrapped myself up tightly before going to sleep. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. They just thought I was being silly and told me to stop watching scary movies. But I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was in my room, and it was getting bolder. One night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat and approached my bed cautiously. I slowly lowered myself to the ground and shone the flashlight under the bed. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a hand under my bed, pale and skeletal, with long, bony fingers. But it wasn't attached to an arm. It was just a hand, reaching out from the darkness. I screamed and swung the bat, but the hand retreated back under the bed. I was shaking and covered in sweat, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't live like this anymore. The next day, I did some research online and found a local paranormal investigator. I contacted them and explained my situation. They agreed to come to my house that night and investigate. When they arrived, we showed them my room and explained what had been happening. They set up their equipment and began their investigation. As they were investigating, I felt a chill run down my spine. It felt like something was watching us. Suddenly, the investigators' equipment started going haywire. The EMF meter was off the charts, and their EVP recorder picked up a chilling voice saying, "Get out." The investigators quickly packed up their equipment and left, telling me that my house was haunted and that I needed to leave immediately. I packed my things and left that same night. I never went back to that house again. I still have nightmares about the hand under the bed, and I'm afraid to sleep with my feet dangling out of the covers. But at least now, I know that I'm not crazy. Something truly terrifying was living under my bed, and I'm just grateful I got out alive. Day 312. That was the day everything changed. It started as a typical day in my small town. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and I had just woken up. But something was off. My internet wasn't working. I tried everything, but no luck. So, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. As I walked, I noticed how eerily quiet it was. No cars, no people, nothing. I was the only one on the street. I walked for what felt like hours until I came across an old abandoned house. It was run down and covered in vines, but there was something about it that drew me in. I cautiously approached the house and peeked through the window. What I saw made me freeze. There was a figure inside, staring right at me. It was pale, with sunken eyes and an open mouth. I couldn't tell if it was human or not. It just stood there, motionless, watching me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was stuck, rooted to the spot. The figure started to move towards me, slowly at first, but then picking up speed. I finally managed to break free and sprinted as fast as I could back to my house. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, coming from somewhere in my house. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sent chills down my spine. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close by themselves, and I would hear footsteps when I was alone. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I woke up to find the figure from the abandoned house standing at the foot of my bed. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was stretched impossibly wide. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It reached out to touch me, and I felt an icy coldness wash over me. The next thing I knew, I was standing outside the abandoned house, staring in at myself sleeping in my bed. I tried to go back inside, but the door wouldn't budge. I was trapped outside, watching my own life unfold. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. I was stuck outside, watching as the figure inside my house took over my life. It would go to work, spend time with my friends and family, and even take over my social media accounts. I was a prisoner in my own body, powerless to stop the figure from living my life. The worst part was, no one seemed to notice that something was wrong. They just thought I was acting strange. Then, on day 312, everything changed. I woke up back in my own body, but the figure was still there. It was no longer in my house, but I could feel its presence, watching me. I tried to ignore it, but it was always there, lurking in the shadows. I knew I had to do something before it took over my life again. So, I went back to the abandoned house to confront it. As I approached the house, I saw the figure standing in the window, beckoning me inside. I hesitated, but then I remembered all the things it had done in my name. I couldn't let it continue. I took a deep breath and entered the house. The figure was waiting for me in the living room, but this time it wasn't alone. It was surrounded by other ghostly figures, all staring at me with dead eyes. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said in a cold, monotone voice. "I need to get my life back," I replied, trying to sound confident despite the fear that gripped me. The figure let out a chilling laugh. "Your life is mine now. You can't take it back." But I wasn't going to give up without a fight. I started to recite an ancient prayer I had found online, hoping it would banish the spirits. Suddenly, the room started to shake, and the figures began to scream. I closed my eyes and kept reciting the prayer until the shaking stopped. When I opened my eyes, the figures were gone and the room was empty. I had done it. I had banished the spirits and reclaimed my life. But the memory of those haunting figures still haunts me to this day. I never take my life for granted anymore, knowing that it could be taken away from me at any moment. And I always make sure to keep my internet connection up and running, just in case. I kiss my wife and daughter goodnight before I go to sleep. It's a routine that I've followed for as long as I can remember. But this time, something feels off. My daughter's eyes seem to hold a sadness that I can't quite place, and my wife's smile seems forced. But I brush it off and settle into bed. As soon as I close my eyes, I'm plunged into a nightmare. I'm standing in a room that's completely white, with padded walls and a single door. I try to open the door, but it won't budge. I'm trapped. Suddenly, the room starts to spin, and I feel myself being pulled towards the ceiling. I try to scream, but my voice won't come out. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stops. I'm standing back in my bedroom, looking down at myself sleeping. I try to wake up, but I can't. It's like I'm trapped in a dream within a dream. I wander through my house, but everything is slightly off. The furniture is in the wrong place, and the pictures on the wall are all different. As I move through the house, I hear whispers. At first, they're too faint to make out. But as I get closer to my daughter's room, they grow louder and louder. It sounds like a group of people chanting in unison. I push open the door to my daughter's room, and what I see chills me to the bone. She's lying in bed, surrounded by shadowy figures. They're all dressed in black robes, and they're chanting in a language that I don't understand. I try to move towards her, to protect her, but I can't. It's like an invisible force is holding me back. And then, suddenly, everything goes black. When I wake up, I'm in a padded room. The walls are soft to the touch, and there's a small window in the door. I try to remember how I got here, but everything is a blur. The last thing I remember is being in my daughter's room. I try to call out, but my voice is hoarse. And then, I see them. A group of nurses, all dressed in white, looking at me with pity in their eyes. "It's okay," one of them says. "You're safe now. It was just a dream." I try to protest, to tell them that it wasn't just a dream. But the words won't come out. I'm trapped, not just in this padded room, but in my own mind. Days turn into weeks, and weeks turn into months. I'm still in the padded room, still being cared for by the nurses. They try to tell me that I'm schizophrenic, that the things I saw weren't real. But I know the truth. I know that what I saw was real. And I know that those shadowy figures are still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. One day, as I'm sitting in my room, staring at the padded walls, I hear a familiar voice. It's my daughter's voice, calling out to me from the other side of the door. "Daddy," she says. "I'm here. Please let me in." I rush to the door, but the nurses stop me. They tell me that no one is there, that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But I know the truth. I know that my daughter is out there, somewhere, waiting for me to rescue her from the clutches of those shadowy figures. And I know that I'll do whatever it takes to save her. As time passes, I begin to see more and more of the shadowy figures. They visit me in my dreams and whisper terrible things in my ear. They tell me that my daughter is theirs now, and that I'll never be able to save her. But I refuse to give up. I know that I need to find a way out of this padded room, out of this nightmare, and find my daughter. One day, as I'm sitting in my room, I notice a small crack in the wall. It's barely visible, but I know that it's my chance to escape. I start to pick away at the padding, tearing it away piece by piece. It takes days, but eventually, I create a hole large enough to crawl through. I find myself in a dimly lit hallway, with doors lining both sides. I can hear the sound of footsteps in the distance, and I know that I need to be careful. I make my way down the hallway, peeking into each room as I go. Most of them are empty, but some contain patients who are too far gone to even notice me. Finally, I come to a room with a single door, just like the one in my nightmare. I push open the door, and I see my daughter lying on a bed, surrounded by the shadowy figures. But this time, they're not chanting. They're just standing there, watching. I try to run towards my daughter, but the figures step in my way. They're not solid, but they feel like an impenetrable force. I try to push through them, but they push back with even greater force. And then, suddenly, everything goes black. When I wake up, I'm back in my padded room. The nurses are looking at me with concern, but I can't focus on them. I'm too busy thinking about my daughter, wondering if she's okay, wondering if she's still out there somewhere. The nurses tell me that I had a seizure, that I'm lucky to be alive. But I know the truth. I know that the shadowy figures are still out there, waiting for their chance to strike again. And I know that I need to find a way to escape this padded room, to find my daughter, and to defeat those shadowy figures once and for all. I had always heard that the world was going to end, but I never thought I would be the last one left. I wandered the empty streets for months, searching for anyone who might still be alive, but there was no one. The silence was deafening, and the emptiness was suffocating. I didn't know how much longer I could last on my own. Then, one day, I found a house that seemed untouched by whatever disaster had befallen the rest of the world. I barricaded myself inside, and that's where I've been ever since. It's been a year, maybe more, since I've seen another living soul. I've resigned myself to the fact that I'm going to die alone, and that's how it's going to be. But then, I heard a knock at the door. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I had always thought that if I were ever to meet another person, it would be a miracle. But now that it was happening, I was terrified. What if this was a trick? What if whoever was on the other side of that door was dangerous? The knocking continued, persistent and urgent. I took a deep breath and approached the door, my hand trembling as I slowly turned the doorknob. I opened the door a crack, peeking out to see who was there. There was no one. I opened the door wider, scanning the empty porch for any signs of life. Nothing. It was then that I noticed the note that had been left on the doormat. It was written in shaky handwriting, barely legible. Please help me. I'm trapped. I didn't know what to make of it. Who had written this note? How had they found me? I scanned the empty streets once again, searching for any signs of movement. There was nothing. I closed the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was it possible that there was someone out there who needed my help? I knew that I had to investigate. I ventured out into the empty world, following the directions written on the note. It led me to an abandoned building, the doors and windows boarded up. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard the knocking again, this time more frantic than before. I approached the building cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that I had to be prepared for anything. I pried open one of the boarded-up windows and crawled inside. It was pitch black inside, and I had to feel my way around in the darkness. I could hear breathing, shallow and labored, coming from somewhere in the room. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response, only the sound of someone struggling to breathe. I followed the sound until I reached a small, cramped room in the back of the building. There, I found a man, barely conscious, lying on the floor. He was covered in bruises and cuts, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for help. I didn't know what to do. I had no medical training, and I didn't have any supplies with me. But I knew that I couldn't leave him there to die. I stayed with him for hours, doing everything I could to keep him alive. I gave him water and tried to make him comfortable. But it was no use. He died in my arms, his last breaths echoing in the empty room. I buried him outside, under a tree. I didn't know his name or where he had come from, but I knew that I had done everything I could to help him. As I stood there, looking at his makeshift grave, I realized something. I wasn't the last man on earth anymore. There were others out there, somewhere. Maybe they were just like me, struggling to survive in a world that had been destroyed. Or maybe they were different, something else entirely. But I knew that I couldn't give up hope. There was still a chance that I could find someone else, someone who might be able to help me survive in this new world. And maybe, just maybe, together we could rebuild something out of the ruins of what had been. As I walked back to my sanctuary, I heard another knock at the door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened it wide, ready to face whatever lay on the other side. And there, standing in front of me, was a group of survivors, just like me. We locked eyes, and for a moment, none of us knew what to say. But then, slowly, hesitantly, we began to speak. And as we did, I knew that I had found what I had been searching for all along. Hope. I never thought it would come to this. My mother, who used to be a loving and caring person, is now a shell of her former self. She's been dead for hours now, and I can't shake off the memory of what I did to her. It started when she came to visit me unexpectedly. She always had a way of just showing up unannounced, as if she had nothing else better to do. But this time, something was different. She seemed agitated and nervous, as if she was hiding something. I tried to ask her what was wrong, but she just brushed me off and started rummaging through my things. I knew I had to get her out of my apartment before she caused any damage, so I made the decision to escort her out. But as I tried to lead her to the door, she suddenly turned around and lunged at me. I could feel her bony fingers around my neck, squeezing tightly. I fought back, trying to push her away, but she was too strong. In a fit of rage, I grabbed her by the throat and squeezed with all my might. I could feel her struggling, but I didn't stop until she went limp in my arms. It was only after I let go that I realized what I had done. I tried to call for help, but it was too late. My mother was gone, and I was left with her lifeless body on my floor. That's when the screaming started. At first, I thought it was in my head, a manifestation of my guilt and fear. But as the hours passed, the screaming only grew louder and more intense. And then, I heard her voice. It was my mother's voice, coming from outside my front door. She was screaming at me, accusing me of her murder. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the screaming only grew louder and more persistent. I could feel myself becoming more and more unhinged, as if my mind was slowly unraveling. I started to see shadows moving in the corners of my eyes, and I could feel the weight of my mother's accusing stare even when I was alone. I knew I had to do something to make the screaming stop, to make my mother's ghost go away. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to the front door and opened it, fully expecting to see my mother's ghost standing there, screaming at me. But there was no one there. The hallway was empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of the building's air conditioning. I stepped out into the hallway, hoping to find some trace of my mother's ghost. And that's when I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her eyes fixed on me. Her face was twisted in a grotesque expression of rage and hatred, and I could feel her malevolence radiating towards me like a physical force. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was stuck in quicksand, slowly sinking deeper and deeper into the floor. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I was back in my apartment, my heart racing and my body drenched in sweat. I could still hear the screaming, but it was fainter now, as if it was coming from a great distance. I knew then that I had to leave that place, that I had to get away from the ghost of my mother and the memories of what I had done. So I packed my things and left, never to return again. But even now, years later, I can still hear my mother's screams echoing in my head. And I can still feel her accusing presence, haunting me wherever I go. I've tried to seek help, to talk to therapists and counselors, but nothing has been able to ease the burden of my guilt. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to escape the ghost of my mother, if I'll ever be able to find peace. But deep down, I know the answer. I killed my mother, and that's something that will stay with me forever. No matter where I go or what I do, I'll always be haunted by her ghost, a constant reminder of my darkest moment. And maybe, just maybe, that's what I deserve. I always thought my cat had a staring problem. No matter what I did, she was always fixated on my face. At first, I thought it was endearing. But as time went on, I started to feel uneasy about it. It was like she was always watching me, even when I wasn't doing anything interesting. But one day, something strange happened. I was sitting on my couch, watching TV, and my cat was sitting on the armrest beside me. As usual, she was staring at me with those big, unblinking eyes. But then, I noticed something strange. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking just behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just an empty wall. I looked back at my cat, and she was still staring intently at the same spot. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of unease that had settled in my stomach. Over the next few days, my cat's behavior became more and more erratic. She started meowing incessantly and would often stare at the same spot on the wall for hours on end. I tried to brush it off as just a quirk of her personality, but the feeling of unease never left me. One night, I woke up to find my cat sitting at the foot of my bed. But this time, she wasn't staring at me or the wall. She was staring at the empty space beside me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as I slowly turned to look beside me. But there was nothing there. Just an empty space on the bed. I looked back at my cat, and she was still staring intently at the same spot. I tried to shake it off and go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of my own breathing. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper, so quiet that I almost didn't hear it. It sounded like someone was speaking right beside my ear, but there was no one there. I looked over at my cat, but she was still staring at the empty space beside me. Over the next few nights, the whispering grew louder and louder. It sounded like someone was trying to communicate with me, but I couldn't make out the words. I started to feel like I was going insane, like the walls were closing in around me. And then, one night, I woke up to find my cat standing at the foot of my bed once again. But this time, she was different. Her eyes were glowing red, and her fur was standing on end. I felt a scream building up in my throat as she started to speak. But it wasn't her voice that came out of her mouth. It was a voice that sounded like it was speaking from the depths of hell. "Join us," the voice said. "Join us in the darkness." I tried to run, to get away from that voice, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, like I was trapped in a nightmare. And then, the whispering grew louder and louder, until it was like 1,000 voices were speaking all at once. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, and then everything went black. When I woke up, my cat was gone. But the feeling of unease stayed with me, like a weight on my chest. I tried to brush it off as just a nightmare, but deep down, I knew that something had changed inside me. And then, one night, I woke up to find my cat sitting at the foot of my bed once again. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, like everything was going to be okay. My cat looked up at me with those big, unblinking eyes, and for a moment, I thought I saw something else in them. Something dark and otherworldly. But then, she meowed softly, and I knew that everything was going to be okay. I reached out to pet her, and as my hand touched her fur, I felt a strange energy coursing through my body. And that's when I knew. My cat wasn't just a cat. She was something else entirely. Something that had been watching me all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. I don't know what my cat is or where she came from, but I do know one thing for sure. I'll never be able to look at her the same way again. The staring cat had become something much more than just a pet. She was a gateway to a world that I never even knew existed. And now, that world was mine to explore. I woke up in the middle of the night, but something was off. I couldn't move. My eyes wouldn't open, no matter how hard I tried. I was completely paralyzed, trapped in my own body. Panic set in as I realized what was happening. Was I having a stroke? A heart attack? That's when I heard it. A blood-curdling scream from across the hallway. It was a sound that chilled me to the bone, and it was coming from my daughter's room. I tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound would escape my lips. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body. Seconds ticked by like hours, and I could hear the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. They stopped at the doorway to my room, and I knew that whatever was out there was watching me. I could feel its presence, feel its gaze upon me. I was helpless, unable to defend myself or my family. Suddenly, the paralysis lifted, and I was able to move again. I jumped out of bed and raced across the hallway to my daughter's room. But when I got there, she was gone. Her bed was empty, and the room was in disarray. Panic set in once again, and I started to search the house. But there was no sign of my daughter. She had simply vanished, as if she had never existed. Days turned into weeks, and the police investigation turned up nothing. No clues, no suspects, no leads. It was as if my daughter had been plucked from this world and taken to some other place, some other realm. But then, one night, I woke up to find myself paralyzed once again. This time, I wasn't alone. My daughter was there with me, standing at the foot of my bed. But something was wrong. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Her skin was cold to the touch, and she radiated an otherworldly energy. I tried to scream, to run away, but I was trapped once again. My daughter started to speak, but it wasn't her voice that came out of her mouth. It was a voice that sounded like it was speaking from the depths of hell. "You can't save her," the voice said. "She's mine now. And soon, you will be too." I woke up the next morning, drenched in sweat. It had all been a dream, I told myself. Just a nightmare brought on by grief and fear. But then I saw it. A scratch on my arm, a mark that hadn't been there before. It was a mark that looked like it had been made by claws, by something that wasn't human. I tried to forget about it, to move on with my life. But the nightmares kept coming, night after night. And every time I woke up, there was another scratch, another mark on my body. Then, one night, I woke up to find my daughter standing at the foot of my bed once again. But this time, she wasn't alone. There were others with her, creatures that looked like they had crawled out of my worst nightmares. They started to circle around me, and I knew that there was no escape. They had come for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the end. But then, I felt something shift in the air. The creatures started to scream, a sound that was like nails on a chalkboard. And then, they were gone. I opened my eyes to find myself alone in the room. But there was something different. I could move again, and I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. It was as if something had been lifted from me, something that had been holding me back. As I looked around the room, I saw that everything was in its place. My daughter's bed was where it was supposed to be, and she was sleeping soundly, as if nothing had happened. But I knew that something had happened. Something that I couldn't explain, something that was beyond the realm of human understanding. From that night on, I never experienced a paralysis again. But every now and then, when I least expected it, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, a movement, a sound that wasn't quite right. And I knew that I wasn't alone. That there was something out there, something that was watching me, waiting for its chance to strike again. I still don't know what happened to my daughter, or what those creatures were. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never forget the terror of that night, the night when I was paralyzed and trapped in my own body. And I'll never forget the feeling of helplessness and fear that came with it. I've been a nurse for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared me for the experience I had with one particular newborn baby. It was a routine delivery, or so I thought. The baby boy was born healthy, weighing 7 pounds and 10 ounces, and measuring 18 inches long. But there was something strange about him. Something that made my blood run cold. When I picked up the chart, I saw the words scrawled in the corner of the page, 32 fully formed teeth. My heart skipped a beat. That couldn't be right. Babies are born with no teeth or just a few, not a full set like this baby had. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I didn't want to alarm the parents, so I kept my concerns to myself. The baby was always silent and always smiling. It was an unsettling smile, almost too wide, and his eyes never seemed to focus on anything. It was as if he was staring through me rather than at me. The parents didn't seem to notice anything strange about their baby, and they doted on him. They would spend hours cooing to him, but he never made a sound. He never cried, never fussed. It was as if he didn't need anything, as if he was sustained by something otherworldly. As the weeks went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something terribly wrong with that baby. But every time I voiced my concerns to my colleagues, they dismissed them as my imagination running wild. They all seemed to be under the baby's spell, just like the parents. Then, one night, I was working the night shift when I heard a sound coming from the nursery. It was a soft, eerie humming, unlike anything I had ever heard before. I cautiously made my way to the nursery, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. The baby was standing in his crib, his head tilted back, his mouth open in a wide smile. But it wasn't just a smile. His teeth were gnashing, grinding against each other in a grotesque display. His eyes were rolled back in his head, and his body was convulsing with a sickening energy. I wanted to scream, to run away, but I was frozen in place. I couldn't look away from the baby's twisted face. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the convulsion stopped, and the baby was once again silent and still, his smile frozen in place. I knew then that there was something truly evil about that baby. I knew that I had to do something to stop him before it was too late. I started doing some research, and what I found chilled me to the bone. There were legends about babies like this, babies that were born with teeth and a strange power. They were said to be possessed by demons, and their smiles were a sign of the devil himself. I tried to warn the parents, but they wouldn't listen. They were blinded by their love for the baby. They didn't see the darkness that surrounded him. I knew that I had to take matters into my own hands. I went to the nursery one night, armed with holy water and a cross. The baby was there, as always, silent and smiling. But this time, there was a glint in his eye that I hadn't seen before. A glint of malice. I approached the crib, reciting prayers under my breath. The baby's smile widened, and his teeth started to gnash once again. But I held my ground. I splashed the holy water on him and held the cross up to his face. The baby started to scream, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the hospital. It was a sound that I will never forget, a sound that still haunts me to this day. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The baby lay there, silent and still, his eyes closed. I thought that I had done it, that I had rid the world of this evil. But then, I heard a whisper in my ear. It was a voice that I didn't recognize, a voice that chilled me to the bone. "Thank you," the voice said. "Thank you for freeing me." I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty nursery and the silent, smiling baby. I quit my job the next day, unable to face the thought of ever returning to that hospital. But the memory of that baby, of the silent smiler, still haunts me. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear his laughter echoing through the halls of my home. I woke up to the sound of hammering. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as the sound grew louder, I realized that it was coming from somewhere nearby. I sat up in bed and listened intently, trying to figure out where the noise was coming from. That's when I heard it. A muffled sound, like dirt being piled on top of something. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead as the realization hit me. I was buried alive. I tried to scream, but my voice was barely a whisper. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to move, but my body felt heavy and unresponsive. I was trapped, helpless and alone. As the minutes ticked by, the sounds of hammering and dirt continued. I could feel the pressure of the earth pressing down on me, crushing me from all sides. I tried to push against the lid of the coffin, but it was too heavy. Panic set in as I realized that I was going to die, buried alive in this tiny, cramped space. I thought of my family and friends, wondering if they would ever find out what had happened to me. Would they know that I had been buried alive, left to die in the darkness? As I struggled for breath, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe I could dig my way out. I tried to use my hands to move the dirt, but it was packed in too tightly. I couldn't make a dent. That's when I heard something even more terrifying than the sound of dirt being piled on top of me. A low, raspy voice, barely audible, whispered in my ear. "Welcome to your new home." I froze. Who was speaking to me? Was I losing my mind? The voice spoke again, louder this time. "You'll never leave this place. You're mine now." I screamed, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear me. But the voice just laughed, taunting me with its sinister tone. Days passed, maybe even weeks, as I lay trapped in the coffin. My throat was raw from screaming, and I could barely breathe. The only sound was the voice, taunting me day and night. Finally, I heard something else. Footsteps, coming closer and closer. I could hear the sound of shovels, digging away the dirt above me. Hope swelled in my chest as I realized that someone had found me. But as the lid of the coffin was lifted, I saw that it was too late. My body was emaciated, my eyes sunken in. I was dead. The police were called, and an investigation was launched. But no one knew who had buried me alive, or why. Some speculated that it was a serial killer, preying on unsuspecting victims in the dead of night. Others thought it was some kind of sick joke. But I knew the truth. The voice, the taunts, the fear. It had all been real. And now, as a ghost trapped in the darkness, I can only hope that someone will find me and set me free. I woke up in the middle of the night to find my wife standing at the foot of my bed. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was dreaming. But when I opened them again, she was still there. "Someone's in the house," she whispered, her voice urgent. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. "What are you talking about? You're not real. You're dead." My wife had been murdered 2 years ago by an intruder. It had been a brutal and senseless act, one that had left me reeling with grief and despair. I had thought I had finally started to move on, but now here she was, standing before me as if nothing had happened. "I know I'm dead," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But you have to believe me. There's someone in the house." I looked around the room, but there was no one there. "I don't see anyone," I said. My wife sighed. "Of course you don't. You're still alive. But I can feel it. He's here, somewhere." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to believe her, to trust that she was somehow still watching over me. But the rational part of me knew that it was impossible. She was dead, and there was no way she could know if there was an intruder in her house. I got out of bed and started to check the house, just to be safe. But as I made my way down the hallway, I heard strange noises coming from the living room. It sounded like someone was shuffling around, trying to be quiet. My heart leaped into my throat. Could my wife have been right? Was there really someone in the house? I crept towards the living room, trying to make as little noise as possible. As I approached, I could see a figure standing in the darkness. It was a man, tall and lanky, with dark clothes and a ski mask. I froze, not knowing what to do. But before I could react, the figure turned and started running towards me. I stumbled backwards, trying to get away, but he was too fast. He tackled me to the ground, knocking the wind out of me. I struggled to get away, but he was too strong. I could feel his cold breath on my face, his gloved hands tightening around my neck. I was about to lose consciousness when suddenly the figure was gone. I gasped for air, coughing and wheezing, but I was alive. And then I saw her again. My wife, standing over me with a look of concern on her face. "I told you," she said. "I told you there was someone in the house." I stared at her in disbelief. How had she saved me? How had she been able to defeat the intruder? But then, as she started to fade away, I realized the truth. My wife had been watching over me all along, even after her death. She had been my guardian angel, my protector, my savior. And as I lay there, gasping for breath and shaking with fear, I knew that she would always be with me, no matter what. Even in death, our love was stronger than anything else in the world.